The warning signs did not arrive softly. They arrived as a collapse on paper, blunt and unmistakable. American farmers watched as nearly their entire export lifeline evaporated at once, with 88% of upcoming soybean contracts disappearing, corn demand falling by almost one-third, and wheat shipments slowing to a near standstill. What once looked like seasonal turbulence now reads like the early chapters of a systemic breakdown, and the numbers coming in from federal agencies only sharpen that picture. According to new national projections, net farm income has fallen by more than 1/4 in a single year, a drop so steep that it rivals the worst declines of the 2008 financial crisis. At the same time, total agricultural debt has climbed to roughly $540 billion, the highest level ever recorded. For the farmers watching their storage bins fill with unsold grain, these are not abstract figures. They are confirmations of what they see every morning when they step onto their land. The situation around grain inventories is even more alarming. New data shows soybean and wheat stockpiles hitting their highest levels in decades, a direct consequence of exports that never left the country. Storage is no longer just tight, it is overflowing, forcing producers to pay for extra warehouse space they cannot afford, or to let crops spoil in place. And while Washington still describes this moment as market adjustment, the math is clearer than the messaging. When income collapses, debt rises, production costs remain elevated, and buyers vanish, the result is not an adjustment. It is the unraveling of a system built on the assumption that foreign demand would always be there. For years, American agriculture depended on predictable flows: plant, harvest, ship, repeat. That rhythm has now fractured. The country has entered a phase where stability is no longer guaranteed, and where optimism sounds less like confidence and more like denial. Farmers are confronting a reality in which the safety nets they were promised do not match the scale of the crisis they are living through. The real story of this moment is not just the disappearance of export orders, but the recognition that the foundation of the farm economy has shifted under everyone's feet. This is not a tough season. This is a reset that no one voted for and no one is prepared for. The shockwaves that hit American farms did not come from the weather, a plant disease, or a sudden change in global diets. They came from policy choices made in Washington, when the United States imposed tariffs ranging from 30% to more than 145% on critical imported inputs, like steel, fertilizer, and machinery parts. The cost of farming surged overnight. Those increases landed hardest on small and mid-size operations already strained by rising interest rates. At the same time, key trade partners responded the only way they could: by walking away. China, once the largest and most dependable buyer of American soy, corn, and wheat, shifted aggressively to Brazil and Argentina. New purchasing data shows Brazilian soybean shipments to China rising by more than 20%, with Brazil also overtaking the U.S. as China's top corn supplier. These moves were not symbolic. They were strategic, long-term, and designed to reduce dependency on an increasingly unpredictable United States. And China is not alone. Across Asia and the Americas, buyers have been quietly testing alternative suppliers. That search became a stampede when U.S. tariffs and retaliatory measures turned agricultural trade into a geopolitical gamble. The result? U.S. wheat exports falling to their lowest level in more than 50 years, with inventories swelling across states like Kansas, North Dakota, and Nebraska. For farmers whose margins were already thin, losing foreign demand didn't just cut profits, it destroyed the economic logic of planting. New surveys show more than 40% of U.S. grain producers now say they cannot break even without stable export markets, an admission that exposes just how fragile the system has become. These are producers who once fed the world, now uncertain if their product will leave the country at all. Those who claim these disruptions are temporary misunderstand how global trade actually works. When a foreign buyer switches suppliers, they don't simply change a name on an invoice. They renegotiate port access, freight routes, storage infrastructure, financing arrangements, insurance terms, regulatory compliance, and long-term contracts. Once that machinery is built, they do not tear it down because Washington decides it wants to reset relations. The United States treated a decades-old trade ecosystem like a light switch, something it could turn off and on at will. But trade partners, burned once, are now designing systems that exclude American volatility entirely. That is the cost of assuming the world would wait. The collapse of export demand did not just impact farmers, it jammed the entire agricultural supply chain like a clogged artery. When grain stops moving overseas, everything backing up behind it becomes heavier, costlier, and harder to untangle. Across the Midwest, storage silos have reached capacity, leaving producers scrambling for alternatives. Many have resorted to renting private warehouses at prices that have quadrupled, a hit so severe that some simply left crops in the field to rot because storing them cost more than they were worth. The backlog extends from the farm gate to the nation's transportation networks. Trains that once hauled steady streams of grain now sit idle or run half-loaded. At major export hubs, ships wait without cargo, creating delays that trigger penalty fees, demurrage charges that exporters must swallow even when the fault lies with broken markets, not broken schedules. These visible bottlenecks are amplified by deeper structural pressures that farmers cannot control. Global fertilizer costs have surged in recent cycles, with international price benchmarks showing an increase of around 20%, pushing input costs far beyond what most mid-size farms can absorb. At the same time, domestic operational expenses continue to climb. New financial data confirms that fuel, equipment maintenance, and chemical inputs have risen between 10 and 14%, squeezing producers who are already dealing with falling crop prices due to oversupply. Every link in the chain, planting, storing, moving, and selling, now costs more while generating less. The entire process has inverted. Farmers spend more money to keep goods that no one is buying. None of this resembles a functional market. It resembles a system in seizure. More than 12% of U.S. grain exports have vanished in the past year alone, contributing directly to nationwide stockpile surges. In some states, grain elevators have refused additional deliveries because they physically cannot take more. That refusal breaks a fundamental assumption of rural America, that the system is always ready to receive what farmers produce. When that assumption collapses, so does everything built on top of it: financing, planting decisions, labor hiring, and community stability. A supply chain once praised for its efficiency has become a bottlenecked maze where no one knows when the next shipment will move, or whether it will move at all. This is not an inconvenience. It is a warning that the nation's food infrastructure is no longer operating with the reliability Americans take for granted. Behind the economic damage lies a quieter crisis that rarely makes headlines: the emotional and financial breaking point now spreading across rural America. When prices crash, buyers disappear, and debts stack up, the fallout does not stay confined to spreadsheets. It shows up in county meeting halls, where farmers, many of them gray-haired men who have survived droughts, floods, recessions, and everything in between, now stand up and admit they may have to sell land that has been in their families for generations. What used to be unthinkable is becoming common, and the new data only reinforces how severe the situation has become. Across the past several years, farm bankruptcies have climbed by more than 50%, a surge driven by falling income, rising operating expenses, and interest rates that have nearly doubled compared to earlier in the decade. The debts, pushing many farms to the edge, are not the result of mismanagement. They are the result of a policy environment that has destabilized the markets those farms depend on. The mental strain is just as heavy. Rural hotlines report spikes in calls marked urgent or life-threatening, and it's no mystery why. When crop prices sink and the bills mount, the question farmers ask themselves shifts from "how do I stay competitive" to "how do I survive another season?" That shift is dangerous, and it's spreading. Making matters worse, the broader food economy has fractured into winners and losers with almost no relation to one another. Major food processors have posted multi-billion-dollar profits during supply shortages, while the farmers supplying the raw goods face input costs rising 20% or more, particularly for feed, fertilizer, and transportation. It is a system where the corporate side of the food chain enjoys stability and scale, while the producers at the bottom absorb every shock. It would be easier to accept these outcomes if the country were told honestly that this was the goal. But it was not. The public was promised stronger markets, better deals, and protection for American farmers. Instead, they got a crisis that forces churches to host suicide prevention workshops and banks to prepare restructuring plans for clients who once paid their loans on time for decades. In Washington, this disaster is still discussed as if it were an unfortunate byproduct of tough negotiating. In farm country, it looks like something else entirely, the predictable result of treating agriculture as a political experiment rather than a backbone of national stability. Out on the ground, the message is not subtle. People are breaking long before the system does. Washington's response to the farm collapse has followed a familiar script: write checks, hold press conferences, and hope the noise dies down before the next election cycle. The latest proposal, a bailout package worth roughly $20 billion, is marketed as relief for struggling farmers, a bridge to carry them through until markets normalize. But farmers are no longer buying that narrative. They have seen this movie before, and they know how it ends. Direct payments can keep the lights on for another month, maybe two, but they cannot reverse the damage done by eroded trade relationships, unstable pricing, and the absence of long-term buyers. As many producers themselves point out, a bailout is not a market. A bailout cannot reopen a closed port, cannot force a foreign mill to choose American grain over a more stable supplier, and cannot undo years of reputational damage caused by policy whiplash. The deeper issue is that Washington keeps answering the wrong question. The problem is not temporary income loss, it is structural market collapse, and every new bailout avoids confronting that reality. Updated analyses show that in previous tariff cycles, the U.S. spent tens of billions of dollars compensating farmers for export losses without fixing the underlying causes. Even more striking, research indicates that traditional supply management systems long abandoned would have cost substantially less while keeping prices stable and preventing the current glut of unsold grain. Yet these ideas remain politically taboo, replaced instead with short-term payments that treat symptoms while worsening dependency. At the same time, the financial foundations of rural America continue to weaken. Rising interest rates and collapsing cash flow have pushed many operations to the brink, and lenders who once specialized in supporting family farms now brace for a wave of restructuring and foreclosure. Meanwhile, a growing number of farm organizations, including groups that historically aligned with conservative trade policy, are demanding that Congress restrict the president's unilateral tariff authority. That shift says more than any press release. When your most loyal stakeholders publicly ask Washington to stop helping, something has gone profoundly wrong. Farmers understand that markets cannot be bullied into existence, and that customers cannot be threatened into loyalty. They know what policymakers seem determined to ignore. Every time the U.S. treats trade policy like a domestic political stunt, foreign buyers make permanent adjustments, and no bailout, no matter how large, can buy back trust that has already moved across an ocean. Even as traditional markets collapse, another force is reshaping American agriculture. The widening divide between farmers and the technology companies now controlling essential tools of production. For years, the pitch behind smart farming was simple: better data, better machines, better yields. But on the ground, the reality looks far different. Equipment prices have surged, with new estimates showing double-digit increases of more than 12% for tractors, harvesters, and core machinery. The result is predictable. Thousands of machines sit idle because farmers cannot justify repairs or upgrades when revenues are falling and credit is tightening. At the same time, companies selling these machines have taken a very different trajectory. Quarterly forecasts now predict stock gains of up to 20%, reflecting investor confidence in subscription-based software models and high-margin precision agriculture systems. In other words, the firms building the tools of farming are thriving, while the people using those tools are drowning. This mismatch is not an unfortunate coincidence. It is the product of a system that increasingly treats farmers not as owners of their equipment, but as customers locked into proprietary ecosystems. Repairs restricted by software locks, diagnostics accessible only through paid platforms, and features disabled unless subscription fees are current. These practices turn essential machinery into leverage. For large operators with deep capital reserves, the shift is manageable, even profitable. But for family farms, it creates a dangerous paradox. To stay competitive, they must invest in advanced systems that they cannot afford and that they do not truly control. As operating costs keep rising, fuel, chemicals, and maintenance up between 10 and 14%, the pressure intensifies. Every decision becomes a gamble. Upgrade and risk bankruptcy, or hold back and risk falling behind. The broader consequence is a quiet consolidation of power. Large, vertically integrated farms can absorb volatility and leverage technology at scale. Smaller farms cannot. The landscape begins to tilt toward fewer, bigger players. And the companies supplying the technology are no longer just equipment manufacturers. They are becoming data gatekeepers, platform operators, and in some cases, de facto regulators of how farming happens. That shift rarely appears in political speeches about helping rural America. but it defines the future more than any bailout ever will. When the tools of production drift out of reach, the independence that once defined American agriculture drifts with them. The question is no longer whether farmers can adapt, but whether the system still has room for those who cannot buy their way into the next technological tier. The collapse unfolding across American agriculture is not the result of a single bad policy, a single weak season, or a single economic shock. It is the convergence of every fault line described so far: the loss of export markets, the surge in production costs, the overwhelming rise in debt, the breakdown of supply chains, and the accelerating power imbalance between farmers and the corporations that now shape their livelihoods. When these pressures combine, they create something far more dangerous than a temporary downturn. They create a structural crisis that reshapes how food is grown, who gets to stay in the business of farming, and whether the United States can continue relying on the assumption that it will always be able to feed itself. Recent projections reinforce this reality. With exports shrinking and farmer finances deteriorating, analysts warn that the U.S. may increasingly depend on imported grain, a shift that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. This risk comes at a moment when global food prices are rising and geopolitical tensions make foreign supply chains anything but secure. At home, the damage extends beyond economics. Rural communities built around grain elevators, processing plants, and farm service businesses now face shrinking tax bases, declining school enrollments, and fewer jobs. When agriculture falters, towns falter with it. And when those towns weaken, the country loses more than output. It loses stability, culture, and the people who have sustained its food system for more than a century. Blaming farmers for not adapting is easy. It is also wrong. They are not failing to adjust. They are being asked to operate inside a system that no longer rewards resilience or long-term commitment. They are competing not only against rival nations, but against political volatility, transportation bottlenecks, financial pressures, and technology structures built to benefit everyone except them. A nation that once celebrated the independence of its farmers now leaves them at the mercy of forces they cannot influence and markets they cannot trust. The question ahead is not whether American agriculture survives. It will, in some form, but who will be left standing when the dust settles, and what kind of food system they will inherit. This moment demands honesty, not slogans, strategy, not improvisation. The future of American agriculture hinges on whether the country chooses to rebuild a system that supports the producers who feed it, or continues down a path that treats them as collateral damage in fights they did not start. The stakes are not abstract. They sit on every dinner table in America. What do you think about this issue? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thanks for watching.